They still keep it in a drawer. A story of dust, naphthalene, and the reckoning that came from the river. A dimly lit study. A drawer slides, open with a sound like a held breath releasing. Inside, paper the color of old tea, thin as onion skin waits. They still keep in that drawer. The one that smells of dust and naphthalene. The marriage certificate. Stamped. Witnessed. Legal. It bears the name of Jeremiah Aldrich in proud, unflinching ink. And beneath his signature, Celeste. Not listed as bride. Listed as property. The document is obscene in its calm legality. But what truly curdles the blood, what makes the skin crawl and the breath catch in the throat, is what followed. 13 deaths, one by one, in the sultry months after the March 1854 ceremony. Each loss wrapped in rumor until the whole parish behaved as though a curse had drifted in from the river fog. Old newspapers, brittle and whispering, hint at a buried investigation. A pact among the city's best families to keep their linen clean by pushing the filth into a locked trunk. But the truth didn't begin with that certificate. It began 15 years earlier, in water the color of coffee, in soil that swallowed footsteps, when a clever, hungry man stepped off a steamer and decided he would not just join Louisiana. He would devour it. Au steamer d'oc. 1839. A man steps onto the wharf. Boots not yet stained with the blood to come. Jeremiah Aldrich came to New Orleans with nothing but nerve and a gift for finding opportunity where decent men refused to look. He wasn't one of the old Creole planters with French on his tongue and portraits on his walls. He was Kentucky clay, tobacco dust, a farmer's failure, reinvented as a broker of people. The old families like to pretend their wealth rose purely from sugar and cotton. That money simply sprouted from cane and bales. But everyone knew the engine was flesh, and Aldrich was willing to oil it. In the brutal heat of 1840, he found his allies. Marcus Dvoreux, a sugar scion nursing a dying estate. Samuel Rochelle, a river-wizened captain whose fortune had bled away to fever and foolish bets. The three formed the Delta Trading Company, a respectable name for a business that thrived in the shadows, where licensed traders sold documented property. Aldrich and his partners made their fortune in the unrecorded and unredeemed. The recovery of escaped people. The purchase of kidnapped free blacks from bounty men who lied for money. The quiet reception of new captives off illegal Caribbean routes. Years after the ban, costs were low because conscience was absent. Profits soared because no ledger recorded what the eye refused to see. In 3 quick years, the trio laundered their sins into status. Dvoreux patched the family plantation and fed it so well it grew fat again. Rochelle bought boats until the river knew his name in wake and timber. Aldrich purchased Willowbrook, a cotton spread, an easy day upriver, crowned by a columned house that declared him arrived. Scene, a study. Night, a fire low in the grate. 3 men. Whiskey. Fear fogging the air like humidity. But prosperity loosens tongues. And success makes men sloppy. By spring 1843, federal marshals had started asking the right questions with the wrong kind of persistence. Somebody was talking. Manifests were being inspected. And worst of all, a few of the recovered had escaped again and were telling stories with names in them. The partners gathered in Aldrich's new study. Books he couldn't read. Portraits of ancestors who weren't his. Panic fogged the room like humidity. Dvoreux wanted to burn papers and vanish. Rochelle counseled patience and a shift offshore. Aldrich had already chosen a third path. Narrow and blood-slick. A warehouse. Slated for demolition. A place that would soon be rubble in memory. A pistol in his coat. A knife in his boot. Whiskey on the table. Ledgers arranged like bait. Kill them both. Take everything. Make it look like greed had turned them on each other. He laid the stage in a warehouse slated for demolition. A place that would soon be rubble in memory. When the talk turned to money trails and the location of cash stashes, Aldrich pulled the trigger into Dvoreux's chest. The echo traveled through timber and night. Rochelle, old but not gentle, fought like weather, surprising and violent. He opened Aldrich's cheek with glass and made the younger man earn every inch of murderous intent. 10 minutes later, the sailor lay dying with a blade in his gut and a vow on his lips. My son knows. He will come. Aldrich staged the scene with meticulous cruelty. Bodies angled for a quarrel. Money scattered like gossip. His own arm scored to pass for self-defense. Paid witnesses remembered hearing voices. Always the victims, never his. The police, busy and grateful for easy conclusions, wrote it up as men destroyed by their own avarice. A week later, the building was gone, and with it, the last honest memory of what had happened inside. The spoils were swift. Aldrich arrived at Banks with documents that said the dead had planned to leave everything to the survivor. Clerks prefer tidy stories when they come with proper seals. Accounts emptied into his pockets. Safes yielded to his keys. The riverboats and sugar lines that had been Rochelle's. He estimated the theft at $40,000. But the more valuable thing he stole was silence. Or so he believed. He had overlooked the simplest arithmetic in human affairs. Men die. Families remain. A dim room. 2 young men. A candle. A ledger. Marcus Dvoriak's brother, Philippe, was 22 and sharp enough to be dangerous. Precisely because patience interested him more than rage. He kept coded ledgers. Knew the patterns of the trade. Distrusted Aldrich long before Bullet solved anything. Rochelle's son, Henri, 24 and educated in the ways of Banks, understood that money leaves footprints even when men do not. Separately, they began to pull at threads. A bribe here, a manifest there, a clerk's whispered recollection in a counting room that smelled of ink and wool. What they found was not merely a crime. It was a system, and they began to design a different kind of prosecution. One that used credit and time as instruments sharper than knives. Their first meeting, in a French quarter room that promised discretion and delivered it, turned 2 private investigations into a conspiracy with a mission. Philippe would move among the parlors and clubs, watching Aldrich build his flimsy version of an aristocrat. Henri would embed inside the city's financial heart, nudging interest rates, tightening renewals, seasoning Aldrich's debts with just enough poison to make them fatal. Months or years later, gambling houses became quiet theaters of ruin, where the cards always found a way to be unkind to one particular man. Loans matured at the worst moments. Rumors traveled by carriage and stayed for supper. By 1851, Willowbrook's fine facade masked a hollowed core. Debts near 30,000. Parcels sold piece by piece. A planter who smiled for company and snarled when it left. The city called it misfortune. Philippe and Henri called it progress. Revenge, however, was not their destination. Justice was, and they meant to define it by making the punishment mirror the crime in pace and pain. Death was too clean, a gallows too quick. They wanted Aldrich alive long enough to understand. So they decided to break him in the one arena where men like him kept their most fragile possessions. Reputation. Dominion. The instrument would be Celeste, Willowbrook's cook, whose hands had prepared his meals for years, and whose eyes had never learned the trick of hiding their contempt. Aldrich had bought her alone in 1847, tearing her from a husband and 3 children. Because it was cheaper to purchase skill without kin. She had watched him tell jokes with blood on his cuffs, had scrubbed the ashes of incriminating letters from a hearth, had learned the clockwork of his days, what he ate, when he drank, which bottle he reached for when his stomach burned. Through trusted intermediaries, Philippe and Henri listened to Celeste, and then told her a truth she already knew. They meant to unmake the man who had unmade so many. She asked only for freedom and a road north when it was done. They promised both. A gambling den. Lamps hissing. Cards soft as silk. Fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. The plan ripened in secret. The banks would tighten one last turn. The gamblers would invite him to a table where luck did not live. The creditors, quietly controlled by Henri, would stand in a single line and offer a single reprieve. Submit to a public humiliation that would annihilate his place among his peers. Or watch the river swallow him with weights tied neat as banknots. They would force him to marry Celeste in daylight and with witnesses. A union legal enough to be unanswerable. Vicious enough to be unforgettable. It would be the first lock on the cage. The first stitch on his shroud. History would later remember the certificate and the funerals that followed. But the story's beginning is not a wedding. It is a choice made in a hot, doomed warehouse. The choice to kill one's partners and believe the river would carry the secret away. Rivers keep many things, but they return what matters. When Jeremiah Aldrich lifted a pistol and traded 2 lives for fortune, the current took note and began, inch by patient inch, to turn against him. Willowbrook, a wedding, guests in summer coats, women with fans, a groom who looks like a portrait done in ash. The fog off the river arrived early that February, slipping between shutter slats, piling up in alleys until the city felt like a room no one had aired in years. Aldrich came to the gambling den to sell his fear for hope. He brought $8,000 in a satchel, and the last of his pride in his posture. For a few hands, the room pretended not to notice either. The game was 5-card stud, the kind that fattens a man's heartbeat and thins his judgment. Dealers rotated with the calm of priests. Watchers leaned in shadows. Aldrich won just enough to believe the tide had turned. He told himself the house on the ridge would survive this season and the next. That creditors would accept smiles and promises if backed by fresh cash. That men who whispered about his ruin would find a new subject by Easter. But the table had been set long before he sat down. Chips climbed. Hands tightened. Luck revealed its favorite trick, arriving late, leaving early, and taking something with it. He chased a straight that bent away, a flush that dried up, a second king that came with a price. By midnight, the room was just breath, heat, and arithmetic. The last 3,000 sat in a stack that looked bigger than it was because his hand shook as he counted. When the final deal came, it wore a friendly face, a visible pair of kings. The suggestion of salvation folded in the hole. He pushed everything forward, the gesture of a man who can't afford to be careful anymore. Across from him, a stranger whose eyes did not blink made the kind of bet that says, "I have seen your future, and it is mine." When the cards turned, the king sank under a full house that looked inevitable in hindsight. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was the sound of a door closing on a man inside a burning room. The other players vanished the way swindled dreams do, quickly and with courtesy. Only the stranger stayed, studying Aldrich as though he were a specimen that might still twitch. He spoke with a French edge to his words and a banker's patience. Debts, obligations. Patience exhausted. The phrases stacked up like stones. Then a second figure stepped from the fog pooling near the door, his face lit by a lamp in a way that made resemblance a kind of haunting. Philippe Dvoraks, whose brother had gasped on warehouse planks 11 years earlier. Smile without warmth. You look like you've seen a ghost. For a moment, Jeremiah believed he had. Henri Rochelle emerged next, completing a triangle that pinned Aldrich to his chair more firmly than ropes. He opened a leather folder and laid out the kind of documents men think they burned. Banking slips, transfers, seized opportunities with forged signatures. A timeline so exact it felt like a noose tightening by degrees. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They described. They named. They cited. They explained how money moves when guided by steady hands. How reputations erode when watered daily with rumor. They told him about his own debts, which it turned out no longer belonged to a scatter of institutions, but to them, quietly purchased, bundled, called in whenever the season promised maximum pain. When Aldrich finally whispered the only sentence a drowning man has left, "What do you want?" They gave him mercy shaped like humiliation. You will marry your cook. Publicly. Legally. Forever. Celeste. The name landed like a verdict. Aldrich laughed in the manner of men who have stepped into a trap and reach instinctively for the comfort of denial. Impossible. No preacher. No court. No society. Philippe adjusted a cuff, as if time were endless. A minister in Natchitoches had discovered an intimacy with gambling debts. Legality could be arranged. Papers would be witnessed. The marriage would stand because the law in this place reveres the performance of its rituals more than the purity of its motives. You will present it as piety, Henri added, his voice mild. A conversion to charity. Amoral o levastion. Your neighbors will be bewildered before breakfast and bored by supper. But the paper will live longer than their shock. Aldrich asked for guarantees. They gave him honesty. None worth more than our word. And our word is weighted to your behavior. Compliance earns kindness. Resistance earns creativity. Philippe slid a contract across the green felt and tapped the line where his signature belongs. The ceremony tomorrow evening. At Willowbrook. Guests invited. Refreshments planned. Dress well. Say the words clearly. Smile when you kiss your bride. Outside, a steamer's horn smeared sound across the fog. Inside, the pen scratched. That night, Jeremiah walked home through streets that refused to hold their shape. The plantation rose out of the dark like a reprimand. He set the satchel on his desk, still heavy with useless air, and looked at the house that had once convinced him he'd become someone else. Willowbrook kitchen. Morning. A woman at the stove. A man entering. A sentence delivered like a death warrant. Morning came with a wet heat and the taste of tin on his tongue. In the kitchen, Celeste stood at the stove where she had stood 1,000 mornings before. The room alive with the small logic of breakfast. The hiss of butter. The sigh of coffee. The thud of a knife on a board. When he told her, he chose the language of obligation and faith, trying to sound like a man announcing benevolence rather than a man reporting a sentence. She listened the way one listens to thunder you've already heard rolling in, then nodded and said she would prepare. No tremor in her voice, no flicker in her eyes, nothing to let him know whether she felt triumph or terror. The calm frightened him more than rage would have. Invitations printed in his name by hands that were not his traveled faster than decency. Curiosity did the rest. By late afternoon, carriages stitched the road with dust and gossip. Men in summer coats and women with fans stepped onto the Willowbrook porch and left small damp crescents where their gloves touched railings. They found a house adorned for joy, a minister with a duly sober face, a groom who looked like a portrait done in ash. Celeste came down the stairs in a simple gown that fit her like an argument no one could refute. She carried herself as if rooms had finally decided to make space for her. Some guests waited for the punchline, others for a scandal, a few for a sign that the whole thing would be interrupted by sense. It wasn't. The minister spoke the old words, sanctified by repetition, indifferent to context. Speak now, or forever hold your peace, hovered in the heavy air, and then passed unclaimed. Aldrich's vow left his mouth in a voice that sounded borrowed. Celeste's answer was clear enough to nail the moment into history. When the kiss came, brief and careful, a murmur moved through the room like a draft. The legalities followed. Signatures written slowly to avoid shaking. A certificate sealed with authority that would outlive everyone present. The guests trickled away, carrying with them a story that would entertain over brandy and trouble sleep later. In the emptied house, furniture looked rearranged even before it was. Celeste walked the rooms with the stillness of someone memorizing a map she already knows. She tested the balance of a chair, adjusted a drape to let in a fraction more light, issued instructions to staff whose eyes flicked between the two of them, learned a new grammar of address on the spot. When Jeremiah protested a decision about a portrait's place, she met his gaze and said, "We are partners now. Husband. Best we learn the work of it." In the first evening of their union, he understood the genius of the design. Death would have been a mercy. This was a mirror. Every hallway, every polished banister, every domestic ritual would tell him who he had been and what had been done to balance the ledger. He lay beside her that night, a stranger in his own bed, counting the beats between her breaths and his, certain there was a cipher in the rhythm, terrified of what it might spell. Days pass. A house learns new echoes. A man begins to unravel. A woman watches with patient precision. Dawn did not bring clarity. It brought routine with knives hidden in it. Coffee a shade more bitter than memory. A tenderness in his limbs that felt like fatigue, collected in the nerves like filings drawn to a magnet. A headache that started behind the eyes and made a home at the base of the skull. He called it stress. He called it weather. He called it anything but what it was. Outside, the parish practiced forgetting. Men who had shaken their heads at the oddity the night before spoke of cotton yields by noon. Ladies who had vowed never to set foot in that house again sent notes of curiosity wrapped in concern by evening. The minister deposited his fee and promised God he had done what was required. Philippe and Henri did not appear. They did not need to. Their work had entered the bloodstream of Willowbrook. The certificate lay drying in a drawer that smelled of ink and lemon oil. Names in their places. Witnesses in their lines. A date that would be consulted when people argued about when the ruin began. But the ruin had started long before. In a different warehouse. With a different plan. Paper remembers. So do rivers. And now so would the walls of this house. Learning new echoes as a woman who had cooked in its heat stepped into its center and began with patience and precision to turn it into something else. Weeks later, the plantation pretends to return to normal. But the normal a mirror gives back when it has warped in the heat. In the weeks after the wedding, the plantation pretended to return to normal. But the kind of normal a mirror gives back when it has warped in the heat. Recognizable and wrong in ways you can't point to until you lean close. Morning began with the same scrape of chair legs on cypress floorboards. The same clink of china. The same breeze lifting the same lace curtains. Only the meanings had been changed, as if someone had quietly relabeled every drawer in the night. Celeste moved through those rooms as mistress now, not by decree, but by gravity, the center of a system that had finally admitted where its weight truly lay. Her voice, once confined to the kitchen's hum, began to set the tempo of other spaces. The front hall, the parlor, even Jeremiah's study, where ledgers pretended to balance. The house learned new sounds. A measured footfall on the main stair at hours when a servant would never dare. The precise click of a key turned from the inside. A soft command that closed arguments before they started. To visitors, the tableau could be arranged to look almost ordinary. Celeste received neighbors with a composed warmth that unnerved them more than any show of triumph would have. She poured tea without spilling a drop and spoke of weather, crops, scripture, the minutiae that grease social hinges. Jeremiah sat nearby and performed the part of a man who had chosen a difficult virtue with clear eyes, nodding in the right places, smiling when the play required it, only the smallest betraying details, his hand hovering over a cup fractionally too long, a glance too quick toward a door he had left ajar, a pause before tasting anything set before him, hinted that the script had been written by other hands. The body is a ledger even the most creative bookkeeper cannot falsify forever. A slow poisoning. A man's private war. A woman's performance of grief. At first, it was only a bitterness in his morning coffee that he blamed on beans or grind or the heat of the kettle. Then a persistent sourness that sat just below the sternum and sang a thin, mean note after dinner. Then a fatigue that no nap could satisfy. The sort of tiredness that steals adjectives and leaves a man with only the noun. He told himself it was humiliation fermenting in the bloodstream, or debts metabolizing into aches. He told himself anything but the truth that his body had already recognized. Something was being added, carefully measured, renewed daily. He began to eat before meals. Bread from a loaf he kept hidden in a locked drawer. Slices cut with a pocket knife. Wiped clean on a linen square he burned afterward in the fireplace. He drank from a separate pitcher only he touched. Stood guard over his glass the way he once stood guard over his money. He changed sleeping rooms without warning, laying his head where a map of his house would not predict. These precautions, which might have saved another man, condemned him in the parish court of opinion. Curiosity became diagnosis. Poor Jeremiah, they said. The strain has unseated him. How sad that the mind, once shaken, drags the body down with it. Celeste abetted the verdict with a performance so subtle it felt like grace. She seasoned her concern with just enough helplessness to be plausible, telling the doctor that he would not eat though she begged him, that his nerves were not quite themselves since the generous act God had called him to, that sometimes he spoke in a voice she did not recognize about creditors who lived in the walls. She wept when it would cost her to weep, quietly, at proper volume. The tears of a woman embarrassed by how much she cares. The staff understood their cues. Meals were prepared under her eye and presented under others. The chain of custody always long enough to allow doubt, but short enough to deny proof. Trays arrived with covers lifted in company. What could be safer than food unveiled in the sight of friends? And yet Jeremiah found reasons to decline. He was not hungry. He had eaten too much at noon. The heat had killed his appetite. Each refusal wrote an annotation in the communal text that read, paranoid, ungrateful, unwell, a collapse, a doctor's visit, a whispered word that falls on deaf ears. When he finally collapsed during a conversation with two cotton buyers, mid-sentence, mid-breath, as if dropped by an invisible hand, Dr. Hamilton Warren responded within the hour. A competent man in a clean waistcoat who had seen the inside of too many sick rooms to be surprised by suffering. He listened to Jeremiah's stuttering explanation that something in the house was wrong, that his food tasted of rain on iron, that his head was full of smoke. He examined eyes and nails, skin and tongue, and he said the careful things doctors say when the truth is too ugly to share without proof. Nervous exhaustion, perhaps, complicated by indigestion. The mind and stomach are cousins, Mr. Aldrich. Stress invites both to mischief. He prescribed rest, a dilute draft, a simpler diet, less coffee, more air. When Jeremiah, desperate, caught his sleeve at the door and whispered the word poison. Just that one hard word, the only one with teeth. Dr. Warren looked past him to where Celeste stood in the hall with a hand on the newel post. Concern arranged on her face like a veil. The doctor had to choose between two implausibilities. A stable, devout wife poisoning her husband with a patience that would make the devil proud. Or a man rattled by public disgrace, inventing an enemy in his own kitchen. He chose the kind conclusion, and let himself be led there by Celeste's steady grief. The diagnosis became a story everyone could live with. Inside that story, Jeremiah waged a private war that made him stranger in every room he entered. He took to carrying small parcels of salt wrapped in paper, testing for bitterness on his tongue, like a pilgrim tasting dust at a shrine. He switched plates with guests in theatrical gambits that only made him appear the more unwell. He hired and fired a footman, not because the man was disloyal, but because his gait reminded Jeremiah of someone who had once stood outside a warehouse door in New Orleans and told a practice lie to a policeman. He wrote 2 letters to a lawyer in Baton Rouge and burned both before the wax cooled on the seals. He turned the mattress, then turned it again, then slept on the floor, convinced poison could climb. Each defense bought him hours, sometimes days, never peace. The house, obedient, watchful, began to absorb the new choreography. Doors that had always stayed open after supper now closed with a hush. Windows that once welcomed night air remained latched. Quiet conversations were held in a pantry full of the clean, dense smell of flour, where voices could be kept low without the performance of secrecy. Celeste adjusted small habits. how long a kettle stayed on the hook, where the spice boxes sat, which knife she used for herbs and which for meat. Each change was both innocent and decisive. On Sunday, she sat in church with a posture that communicated both dignity and burden. And when parish women touched her elbow and asked in practiced whispers how her husband was bearing up, she answered with a sentence that fell on both sides of every fence. God is testing us, but he is kind in the testing. The women repeated the line over ham and jelly the way people repeat scripture when they intend belief to do the work of evidence. A dinner party, a toast, a collapse, a whispered truth in a dying man's ear. One evening in late May, when heat pressed the skin like a damp palm and frogs stitched their warnings into the edges of the fields, Celeste announced a small dinner to mark 3 months of marriage. The guest list favored those whose opinions traveled farthest. The minister who had performed the service, a planter's wife whose parlors mapped the parish's gossip, a merchant whose credit notes could flavor a man's season sweet or sour with a signature. Table linens white as threats, candles that bled just enough, silver polished until it reflected faces back with slight improvements. Jeremiah prepared for the ambush he could not describe. He ate beforehand, bread, cheese, a pear, with the furtive haste of a thief, and rinsed his mouth like a man who feared his own saliva had been compromised. He rehearsed a dozen refusals for wine, and then burned them all when she presented the bottle opened at the table. The court pulled in view, the minister's hand steadying the neck as if to bless it. A toast to union, to endurance, to the Lord's mysterious mercies. There are moments when performance shackles even the unwilling. He raised the glass because the script demanded it, because to refuse would be to confirm every diagnosis whispered in every kitchen, because he could not prove the invisible. The wine tasted fine, not sweet, not thin, merely present, a red with a modest opinion of itself. The poison, if poison there was, did not announce in trumpet tones. It preferred the flute. 10 minutes later, his stomach tightened as if clenched by a small, deliberate fist. The room rimmed in brightness. The air grew granular. Voices arrived from a distance, as if spoken through cloth. He stood and sat in the same motion. Reached for the table and missed. Tried to say Celeste and managed only see. Dr. Warren was out of his chair before the glass completed its small catastrophe against the cloth. He barked instructions. Space. Air. Loosen the collar. Not because he believed they would rescue the fallen man, but because action is the only antidote to a certain kind of fear. Celeste outperformed them all. She fell to her knees beside Jeremiah with a sob that startled even the frogs outside. Cradled his head so the doctor's hands had to work around her devotion. Prayed aloud with such fierce sincerity that the minister closed his eyes and added an amen that did not belong to medicine. In that careful confusion, she bent her head until her mouth was near Jeremiah's ear and said the first utterly true sentence he had heard in months. We have been working since 1845, and you are not dying alone by accident. She named her dead as his dead, marked her blood to the blood he had spilled, and then raised her face, wet and exemplary, to ask if anyone had smelling salts. He tried one last time to reframe the picture, to reach for the corner and pull it back to reveal a different scene beneath. His fingers closed on linen and let it go. The doctor pronounced what a room full of witnesses could live with. Natural causes. Exhaustion made flesh. The minister arranged scripture the way one arranges flowers, hiding blunt stems with greenery. The merchant offered credit on gentle terms to the widow because kindness, when displayed publicly, gains interest. The planter's wife touched Celeste's cheek in a privilege she would not have claimed 3 months earlier, and said the line parish women say when language fails. If you need anything, the night gathered itself back up. The guests stepped in a heat that made the sky ring. In the hallway, on a wooden table where lists and letters go to be sorted and sent, The marriage certificate lay in its drawer. A paper heart still beating. Upstairs, a bed unlearned a man's weight. Down in the kitchen, the stove exhaled and went cold in a way that felt almost like relief. And Willowbrook, bruised, listening, took on one final sound it had never known before. The careful quiet of a house that has just consented to remember everything. After the funeral, a widow, a clerk, a signature that closes one door and opens another. The day after the funeral, the house wore grief like a garment that fit too well. Black ribbons on the gateposts, lilies staling in bowls. A thin trail of carriage ruts pressed into the damp road, like stitch marks that would not heal. The parish accepted the doctor's verdict because it fit the shape of their comfort. Natural causes, they said, and by afternoon, natural meant anything that allowed men to eat supper in peace. The minister took his fee and left with a gaze that lingered just once on Celeste's face, as if he had glimpsed a glint beneath water and could not decide whether it was coin or stone. Celeste did not hide. She received condolences with the exact weight each caller required. More from the ladies who needed tears to feel generous. Less from the men who feared what emotion might stain their gloves. She stood in the doorway and let the house arrange itself around her, as if it had been waiting for this center all along. The word widow fit her oddly in the mouths that used it. But the law, so particular about the shape of signatures and the neatness of seals, had already learned to say it smoothly. Widow, mistress, heir, Henri Rochelle, and Philippe Dvoraks did not come to the funeral. They sent a wreath of camellias whose petals looked like folded letters and a brief note in a hand no one recognized. But their true presence walked in behind a clerk from First National 2 mornings later, with a folio that smelled of paste and deliberate ink. He brought accounts rendered, mortgages tallied, interest added in the small, merciless way of arithmetic. He asked for the widow's signature with the calm of a man who knows which way the tide is flowing. In the study where Jeremiah had once rehearsed the swagger of solvency, Celeste read what had already been decided. Debts consolidated, collateral named, cure proposed, transfer of Willowbrook to a newly incorporated enterprise that would regularize obligations and preserve stability. She traced the legal language with a fingertip, as if it might smudge and show the truth beneath. When she signed, the scratch of the pen sounded like a breath finally exhaled after years of holding it. "What will you do now, Mrs. Aldrich?" the clerk asked, because some habits of politeness survive even inside predation. "I will do the thing I promised," she said, and closed the folio as if closing a casket. A road north, a woman in flight, freedom on paper, a chain of hands. Promises, like rivers, have tributaries. The first ran north. Freedom on paper is a trick candle, easily blown out by the wrong breath. So Henri had arranged a second light that could not be pinched between fingers. A packet of documents that moved faster than rumor. A chain of hands that could carry a woman farther than any coach. Manumission verified. Travel permits copied thrice and folded inside each other. Names for certain doors. Silences for certain roads. At dusk, 3 days after the last mourner left, Celeste went down the back steps she had climbed for 7 years and walked across the yard with an empty basket on her arm, the way she had 1,000 evenings. The air was heavy with the smell of turned earth and lily rot. The nightjar started up as she reached the edge of the cane. In the field's first row, where stalks make a chapel for secrets, a mule cart waited. A woman at the reins whose kerchief held blue in it, even in that light. "Evening, Miss Celeste," the driver said, using the honorific with a quick little smile, as if tasting a future before it arrived. "Name's Dina. We ain't much for speeches on this road." They traveled the way free people travel when the land does not yet agree with their freedom. Forward by inches, pausing for the dark to lean in, listening to how water talks when it crosses stone. In a cypress grove, Dina whistled like a thrush, and a boy the size of a question led them by paths that did not exist on maps. At a ferry that wasn't a ferry, a man in a hat too big for his head took the reins and asked nothing. They slept in a smokehouse that smelled of hickory and old secrets. Rose before the roosters. Moved again. Each station knew only the next. Each helper kept only the necessary facts. Each mile sensibly forgot the one behind it. On the third night, a lantern blinked once, twice, across a bayou like an eyelid with a code in it. And the boat that had no name and no owner glided out of the reeds. The oarsman wore the river like clothing. He did not ask about the papers Dina kept in her bodice or the packet Celeste had hidden in the hem of her dress. Letters for a woman in Cincinnati. A cousin of someone who had been Samuel Rochelle's niece once removed. Origins and conclusions were luxuries. Their work concerned continuations. Will you go when up becomes down? He asked. More to the water than to her. Canada, she said. Saying it out loud cooled her mouth. He nodded. Cold's attack the law can't collect. The journey. The country of caution. A woman learns to move like water. They moved at night. By day, they learned how to wait without being seen. Celeste studied the country of caution. The way dogs rehearse bark to see if it sells fear cheaply. The way a white man's laugh on a porch can suck the air from the road. The way pines talk when riders pass under them too slow. She learned where to step in a swamp and where the ground will keep your foot like an ungenerous host. She watched Dina count seconds between clouds and sun. She kept her own counsel and her own pace and a small vial of something bitter in a pocket near her skin because mercy may be divine, but contingency is human. News travels differently when people carry it in their bodies instead of on broadsides. Somewhere outside Natchez, a farm girl whispered to a stable boy that Willowbrook had a new widow who wore calm like armor. In Vicksburg, a man with a scar across his chin said that a planter had married a cook and died, which proved the Lord had a sense of comedy. In Memphis, where river and rail spoke to each other in smoke, someone muttered that Louisiana men had started looking over their shoulders when they signed notes. The story changed shape as it climbed latitude, but its spine remained. There had been a reckoning that made sense in a place where sense rarely survived. Celeste crossed state lines the way a dancer crosses from one measure to the next. On the beat, with breath measured, knowing that to rush is to stumble. In Kentucky, she walked under trees that made shade kindly instead of aggressively and refused to misunderstand the softness as safety. At a tavern where abolition lived behind careful beer and a piano missing 2 teeth, a woman with hands like laundry took Celeste's face between her palms and said, I knew your Aunt Mary and your mother. You carry her mouth. That night, Celeste slept deep and dreamless for the first time in years, waking with salt dried on her cheeks and her jaw unclenched. Canada entered the conversation as a real place on a morning when the sky began higher than it had the day before. A man in a coat too heavy for spring quoted distances like scripture and pointed with his whole body. There, he said, and he did not mean a town. He meant a direction that had been polished by many feet. On the last night before the crossing that turns fugitive into citizen by virtue of cold in court, Dina hugged Celeste as if sealing wax. You get your name back, Dina said. Say it to yourself so it learns the road. My name was always mine, Celeste answered. And they both laughed because the truth can be a blade and a sweetness in the same mouth. Canada. Snow. A new life. A ledger that continues its work. She crossed with papers in a tin under her skirt. A breath in her chest she didn't spend until her soles found snow that squeaked. Men with hats that looked like fir trees said, welcome, in a language of ledger stamps and nodded toward a woman with ink on her fingers and milk on her sleeve. The woman took Celeste's hand and said, you're just in time. Spring is a busy season for new lives. If the North gave her ground, it also gave her mirrors. In a boarding house that cooked hope with onions, she unfolded the packet Henri had tucked into the marriage contract and read the last letters from New Orleans. News of small, good cruelties. Willowbrook had been signed over to a trust with an innocent name. The fields would be worked this year by men and women paid in cash and secrecy. A basement room that once held iron rings now held quilts and bread. Wagons arrived at hours when the river forgot to gossip. A trapdoor that a carpenter accidentally enlarged admitted more than coal. The overseer had been dismissed for cause and left with his black eye swagger torn at the seam. The sheriff drove by twice and found nothing to inhale. Only the clean scent of wash on a line. The boring hum of account books that balanced. Henry's handwriting confessed a satisfaction he practiced hiding. We are learning the math of mercy, and it profits more steadily than sin. Philippe's note was shorter and wore its quiet like a badge. The house is changing its mind about what a house is for. Celeste closed her eyes and saw for the first time the plantation not as a wound, but as a door. She imagined the big room with a long table set not with silver, but with maps. The yard full of laundry that did not mean servitude. The track to the river worn by shoes that chose to walk it. She saw a girl of 10 with her mouth. A boy with hands like his father's. Another child whose features she gave herself permission not to imagine. Years pass. Willowbrook changes hands. The ledger closes. The river remembers. The first winter without Jeremiah Aldrich settled over Louisiana like damp linen. Frost rimmed the edges of fields where cane once gleamed. The river, fat with silt and secrets, slowed its gossip to a murmur. To the neighbors, Willowbrook was a curiosity dulled by distance. A plantation with no master, managed by accountants and silent men in clean coats who never stayed for supper. To the few who looked longer, it became something stranger. A house that seemed to breathe differently at night. Its lights moving in patterns that did not belong to a widow's mourning or to any ordinary trade. In New Orleans, Philippe Dvoraks sat behind a banker's desk under a false name and reviewed ledgers whose numbers told stories louder than sermons. Every entry from Willowbrook now had a twin that lived beneath the ink. A quiet notation written in a cipher he and Henri had devised years ago when revenge was still a theory whispered between drinks. Above each line of cotton yields or freight costs, invisible in ordinary light, ran another column. For souls carried north. 2 children sheltered. 1 family passed safely. What had once been a slave ledger had become its opposite. A book of debts repaid in freedom. Henri Rochelle, meanwhile, had transformed his father's network of river captains into a flotilla of deliverance. The same boats that once hauled barrels of sugar and sacks of cotton now carried cargo, far more precious. Families packed in silence beneath false flooring, their breath set to the river's rhythm. Each captain knew only the next link in the chain. The pattern of deliveries and departures was disguised as commerce. Crates of molasses marked with a discreet W found their way from the bayous to Baton Rouge, then upriver to Memphis, then further still. Invoices were paid promptly. Questions drowned quietly in profit. Every month, Henri traveled to Willowbrook under the guise of inspection. He arrived in daylight, papers in hand as the plantation's legal executive. At dusk, when the fields turned to smoke and the cicadas sang, he opened the hidden rooms. Beneath the main hall lay the old storage vaults. Brick chambers once used for chains and tools, now lined with quilts, candles, and the smell of hope. Children's shoes scuffed patterns into the dust where shackles had once hung. Celeste's letter from Canada sat framed above the hearth. The ink faded but legible. For every mile we walked in fear, let another walk in freedom. Henri read it aloud to each new arrival before they moved on. It was not scripture, but it served. The haunt. A house remembers. A ledger balances. Still, ghosts are poor tenants. They pay in memory, not coin. Willowbrook carried them easily at first, then heavily. The house remembered Jeremiah in its bones. Doors that had once shut cleanly now stuck halfway, as if resisting the act of closure. Mirrors clouded for no reason. Servants said the study smelled of metal on certain nights. Some swore they saw a man standing by the upstairs window during storms, his face pale and restless, staring down at the yard where wagons came and went under moonlight. Philippe dismissed such tales until one evening when the books would not balance. He was alone in his office, the city thrumming beyond the shutters, and the numbers on the page began to blur. For an instant, the columns reversed. Profits became losses. Names became weights. And he saw, superimposed on his fine handwriting, the old accounts of the Delta Trading Company. The names of the dead, the bought, the sold. Jeremiah's handwriting at the bottom, steady and elegant. He blinked, and the vision dissolved, leaving him sweating and cold. He closed the book and whispered, "Not forgiven, only used." Henri, too, felt the haunt. He dreamed of water rising inside the warehouse where their fathers had died. But instead of corpses, it was filled with ink. The black tide licking at ledgers until every number floated away. In the dream, a voice that might have been Jeremiah's said, "You built your justice on the same foundation." And perhaps it was true. The machinery of revenge and the machinery of redemption shared cogs. Money still moved in secret. Silence was still bought. The difference lay only in destination. The end of an era. The vault sealed. The key buried. By spring, the refuge at Willowbrook had become legend. Whispered among enslaved people from Natchez to Mobile. A place where a widow's ghost opened the door if you knocked right. Henri knew the network could not last forever. Too many mouths. Too many miracles invite scrutiny. He began the careful work of dismantling success before it drew its own gallows. Routes were shifted northward. Plantations along the Mississippi quietly inherited Willowbrook's role. By summer's end, the house stood empty more often than not. On the last night of operations, Philippe rode down from New Orleans. The two men met in the study where the revenge had been conceived a lifetime ago. They poured whiskey into glasses that caught the lamplight like small fires. "It's done," Henri said. "The last group crossed the river yesterday. 26 souls. A fitting number. Half of what he sold in one season," Philippe murmured. A ledger closing then. They sat in silence until the clock in the hall struck 12. Outside, thunder rolled low and slow, as if the river itself were turning over in its sleep. "What now?" Henri asked. Philippe looked at the portrait above the mantel. The false ancestor Jeremiah had bought with the house. He smiled without humor. "Now we do what honest men do. We disappear. At dawn, they sealed the vaults and buried the key beneath the magnolia tree where Jeremiah's grave marker leaned, its name already fading. Papers were filed in New Orleans to transfer ownership once again, this time to a charitable trust for agricultural education. The law never inquired what sort of lessons were taught. Years pass. War comes. The river changes course. The ledger surfaces. Years passed. The war came and broke the old order like a bone long waiting to snap. Fires took half the parishes. The river changed course. Men who had ruled with pistols and pulpits fled or fell silent. When the smoke cleared, someone rediscovered Willowbrook's overgrown fields and the house that still stood, stubborn and quiet. In its cellar were quilts folded with impossible care, small wooden toys, and a single ledger labeled "Debt Settled." No one could read the code, but the handwriting was beautiful. In a city archive, the marriage certificate of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste remains pressed between pages that crumble at the edges. Scholars sometimes pause over it, puzzled. Why would a man of his status sign such a document? Why was his death so quickly forgotten? They never asked the better question. How many lives began because his ended? And in the north, where snow still remembers footprints long vanished, an elderly woman once told her grandchildren about a house that opened its doors at midnight. She called it the place where ghosts learned mercy. When they asked if it was real, she smiled and said it was true. The river far below kept its promise to remember, and like any good accomplice, told no one. New. Reconstruction. A government agent. A ledger that refuses to stay closed. By the time the 1860s bled into smoke and surrender, Louisiana's river towns had become museums of contradiction. Freedmen's shanties leaned against burned mansions. Songs of deliverance tangled with hunger. The Mississippi, swollen with spring melt and memory, carried pieces of both eras. Splinters of barges, musket balls, stories too heavy to sink. Among them was Willowbrook's last secret, buried once in dirt and again in silence, now surfacing like a truth that refuses to drown. The house still stood, though the paint had peeled to reveal the grain beneath. Like veins showing through tired skin, ivy crept up the columns, swallowing the cemetery. Locals called it the widow's house. Some said they'd seen light through its cracked windows on nights when the fog came down from the river. Others swore they'd heard a woman humming inside, a low tune, neither hymn nor lament, steady as the pulse of someone remembering. The war had erased property lines and rewritten hierarchies, but it could not erase gossip. Veterans returning from the front traded tales of Willowbrook's ghost, of a plantation that had sheltered fugitives instead of selling them, of two men, bankers or smugglers, no one agreed, who'd vanished after the Confederacy's fall, leaving behind ledgers written in invisible ink. Such stories were sustenance in lean years. They fed the imagination when bread was scarce. In 1867, a government agent named Jonathan Keats rode up the Old River Road on a borrowed mule, carrying orders to catalog abandoned estates for Reconstruction taxation. He was a New Englander born to abolition sermons and quick arithmetic. The locals distrusted him on sight. His coat too black, his accent too sharp, his questions too precise. When he reached Willowbrook, he found more questions than answers. The front door opened on a smell of damp paper and time. The drawing room's wallpaper hung like loose skin. The piano's keys were yellowed and silent. But the study, the heart of the house, was oddly clean. Dust had respected its borders. On the desk sat a single object, a book bound in cracked leather. Its title faded, Ledger of Accounts, 1854 to 1856. The ledger, a discovery, a ghost who will not be silent. Inside, the first pages were ordinary enough. Entries of seed, sugar, cotton, wages. Then halfway through, the ink changed. Names replaced numbers. Notes appeared in a second hand. Finer, more deliberate. Eliza and Jacob, safe to Memphis, April 7th. Mary's boy crossed to Illinois, August 12th. The river keeps its word. Keats turned the pages, his pulse quickening. He recognized what he held. A record of the Underground Railroad, written in the language of commerce, cloaked as plantation business. Each shipment was a life, each prophet a rescue. It was a book of salvation disguised as sin. He spent 2 nights at Willowbrook, sleeping in the parlor because the upstairs floors creaked as if remembering footsteps. On the second night, he woke to water dripping, slow, measured, and the faintest sound of someone walking in the hall. The air smelled faintly of iron and burnt sugar. He rose, lamp in hand, and followed the noise to the study. The door stood open. On the desk, the ledger lay shut, though he had left it open. A single page had been marked with a pressed magnolia petal, perfectly preserved. Beneath it, in handwriting finer than any he'd seen before, someone had written, "Debt settled. Let them rest." The words blurred as he stared. He was certain the ink had not been there before. When he looked up, the window was open, though the latch was rusted tight. And beyond it, the river gleamed silver and endless. Keats left Willowbrook before dawn, taking the ledger with him. In his report, he described the house as structurally unsound and spiritually occupied, an entry that drew laughter from his superiors but ensured no one else was sent. The book, however, found its way to Washington, where it was filed among thousands of unclassified documents. Forgotten, but not lost. A new century, an archivist, a signature that refuses to fade. Years later, when the Library of Congress began cataloging unidentified antebellum manuscripts, a young archivist named Caroline Whitlam, opened the ledger. She traced the faint undertext that earlier eyes had missed. A series of symbols that when viewed under lamplight revealed coordinates along the Mississippi. Each point corresponded to a known safe house. Some verified, others long dismissed as myth. In the margin of the last page, almost invisible, was a single signature. C. Aldrich. For Caroline, it was the first time she had ever seen a freed woman's name bound into history. Not as testimony, but as author. She followed the trail years later, visiting the places the ledger described. Most were gone, reclaimed by weather or willful forgetting. But at the bend near St. Charles Parish, where the willow trees leaned over the water, she found what the map had promised. A stone half buried in the earth, its inscription nearly erased by rain. Celeste Aldrich, born enslaved, died free. The river keeps its word. Standing there, she thought she heard the low hum of a woman singing somewhere beyond the reeds. Perhaps it was wind. Perhaps it was the river remembering how to tell the truth. That night, Caroline wrote in her journal, "Justice is not a single act. It is an echo that finds new throats across generations. The hands that once signed ownership now sign remembrance. And the house that was built on pain has learned at last to shelter mercy." Below her words, she pressed a fresh magnolia petal. The river took its time, carrying the story north. But carry it did. And when the current reached Canada, where snow still kept Celeste's footprints safe beneath it, the water slowed, as if bowing. The confession was complete. The ghosts could rest. The 20th century, a house that remembers, a river that speaks. By the time the 20th century came swaggering down the river with steamboats and photographs, Willowbrook was no longer a plantation. It was a ghost of one. The cane fields had gone a wild grass. The barns collapsed into themselves. The main house sat like a half-awake sentinel overlooking the slow brown water. To strangers, it was just another ruin. One more relic from the South's fevered dream of grandeur. But to those who listened carefully, the house still spoke. It creaked in a particular rhythm on humid nights. As if counting, the shutters clapped once at dusk and twice before dawn, whether wind touched them or not. And in the study, the only room that refused to mold or rot, papers sometimes rearranged themselves into neat piles, though no hand had touched them for decades. Locals avoided it. Children dared each other to throw stones at the porch. And those who did swore they heard footsteps behind them all the way home. Preachers said the place was unholy. Poets said it was holy in a way the world no longer understood. And the river, indifferent as ever, kept humming its low song against the bank. A school teacher. A discovery. The house begins to speak. In 1902, a school teacher named Miss Evangeline Cross came down from St. Louis with more curiosity than sense. She had been sent by the New State Historical Society to gather relics of local color for an exhibition on Reconstruction. She expected faded documents, maybe a diary or two. She did not expect Willowbrook. Her first sight of the house was through a veil of Spanish moss, its long strands trembling in wind that didn't exist. The road was barely a road, just a scar through the trees. When she stepped onto the porch, the board shifted but didn't splinter, as if acknowledging her politely. Inside, dust floated like the ghosts of breath. The parlor smelled of paper and rain. But the study, the same room that had witnessed plotting, poison, and liberation, stood immaculate, preserved by accident or intention. The desk still faced the window toward the river, and above it hung a portrait of a woman with dark eyes and the faintest trace of amusement. The plaque beneath reads simply, Celeste Aldrich, 1810 to 1881. Evangeline felt the prickle of recognition, though she couldn't have said why. She touched the frame. The canvas was cold, but the air behind her warmed slightly, as if someone had stepped too close. She found the ledger, too, tucked inside a false drawer she discovered by mistake when her pen rolled between the boards. Its pages were brittle. Ink faded to the color of tea. The handwriting changed halfway through. First sharp and mercantile, then graceful and deliberate. The final page bore a single line written in that fine hand. If they forget our sins, remind them of our mercy. Evangeline copied the line into her notebook, thinking it a curious epigraph for a plantation account book. She would later describe it as a whisper that did not belong to my century. Restoration. The cellar. A wall of names. Her report reached Baton Rouge. Soon after, funds were allocated to preserve Willowbrook as a site of cultural memory. By 1905, carpenters were repairing the porch, masons resetting the columns. They found coins buried beneath the threshold, each dated a different year, each polished clean by unseen hands. The foreman ordered them sealed back under the new floor. For luck, when work began on the cellar, the men uncovered the brick vaults where Philippe and Henri had once sheltered fugitives. At first they thought the markings on the walls were mere scratches, but under lamplight they saw they were names. Hundreds of them, etched with nails and bits of metal. Mary, Jacob, Ruth, Isaiah, and so many others that the walls seemed to breathe. Beside each name was a symbol. Crosses, stars, arrows, some pointing north, some circling back. The discovery turned the restoration into a pilgrimage. Descendants came, historians came, preachers came to see where scripture had been rewritten in brick. The state, never quick to own its ghosts, declared Willowbrook a heritage landmark. A brass plaque was bolted to the gate. Willowbrook House, founded 1839, transformed 1854 from bondage to refuge, from silence to song. Tourists began arriving in carriages and later in cars, eager to see where the widow's house had stood against the tide of cruelty. They brought coins to leave at the threshold, flowers for Celeste's portrait, prayers whispered in accents from both sides of the Mason-Dixon. At night, the caretakers reported hearing footsteps in the hall. Sometimes a lamp would light itself in the study. The faint scent of magnolia would drift through the air, but no one was afraid. It's her, they'd say, just making rounds. Descendants return. The river testifies. Decades later, the descendants of those first rescued families began to return, not as fugitives, but as guests. They came from Chicago, New York, Montreal, bringing children who ran freely across the fields their ancestors had crossed in fear. They read the names in the cellar and found their own among them. They touched the grooves with trembling fingers, as if tracing veins back to a common heart. In 1938, an elderly woman named Miriam Rochelle arrived with a folded letter in her handbag. She was Henry's granddaughter, a school principal in New Orleans. The letter, brown and fragile, had been passed down through her family. It was addressed simply, to the one who finds peace where I cannot. From Philippe Dvorяк's. Inside were a few lines written in a hand that shook even when ink was plentiful. We built this refuge from the bones of our guilt. May those who follow build mercy from our bones. She left the letter on the desk beneath Celeste's portrait, placed her hand over the wood, and whispered, "You did." Seeing the flood. The river returns what it owes. By the mid-1900s, Willowbrook had become a museum, a school, and a story. Children learned they're not only about slavery and war, but about the dangerous, necessary act of remembering. Teachers told them that the ledger's second half, the one written by Celeste, was the first record of emancipation written from within bondage itself. Her handwriting had turned ownership into witness. But not all visitors came for reverence. Some came for spectacle, for the thrill of haunted history. They asked where the poison was mixed, where the body fell, whether the ghost still sang. For them, the guide would light a candle and let the shadows tell the rest. If you listen close, she'd say, you can still hear the river answering. And sometimes they did. When the great flood of 1927 came roaring through Louisiana, it swallowed whole towns, rearranged the river spine, left silt where memories had been. The waters reached Willowbrook, lapped at its foundations, and then, as if remembering a promise, withdrew. When the flood receded, the ground around the house was swept clean, and at its base lay dozens of objects washed up from the past. A rusted pistol, a silver locket engraved with a name, a child's shoe no larger than a teacup, and a brass key still on its string. The curator who found them wrote in her log, "The river has returned what it owed." Willowbrook survived every storm after that, though no one could quite explain why. Engineers cited elevation. Believers cited grace. The house had learned to stand in two worlds at once, the one of brick and law and daylight, and the other of echoes, mercy and song. The 21st century. A researcher. A house that speaks across time. By the time the 21st century bent its light across Louisiana, Willowbrook no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to the space between memory and myth. Drone footage captured its green roof glinting like an eye half open beside the slow brown river. History students wrote essays about it. Filmmakers came for the shadows in its hallways. Tourists stood in reverent lines to touch the portrait of the woman once listed as property and whispered her name as though it might still summon courage. In 2019, a graduate researcher named Jordan Keller arrived with a tablet, a camera, and the same tremor of curiosity that had drawn others before. Jordan's project, Economic Ledgers of Moral Reconstruction, was meant to trace how Southern plantations converted to legitimate businesses after emancipation. But what Jordan found was a story that refused to stay still. On the second night of cataloging, the power failed. The house sank into a hush so complete that the roar of the river could be heard inside its walls. Using a phone's weak light, Jordan descended to the cellar, the refuge that had once been a tomb, and found the carved names still gleaming where moisture had darkened the brick. Under one of them, Mary's Boy, 1855, a new groove had been scratched. Shallow, but deliberate. Remember us kindly. Jordan's first instinct was skepticism. Vandals. Caretakers. Maybe a child with a pocket knife. But the dust on the floor had not been disturbed. Later, while reviewing infrared scans of the study, the tablet captured faint handwriting invisible to the naked eye across Celeste's portrait frame. It was not paint. It was soot. The words translated from the curving scroll read, "The river still speaks. You have only to listen. The Floodlight Project. Technology meets memory." That discovery revived Willowbrook in ways no state funding ever could. A group of historians, artists, and local volunteers formed the Floodlight Project, dedicated to turning the estate into a living archive. They believed that remembering wasn't enough. Remembrance had to breathe. Under their hands, the cellar became a gallery of light. Laser scanners mapped each etched name, projecting them onto the walls so visitors walked through constellations of liberation. A 3D rendering of the original ledger, its invisible ink translated into visible gold, floated on touchscreens. Children traced the glowing paths with their fingers, learning routes that once existed only in whispers. When the project launched, the first image displayed was of Celeste Aldrich's signature. Graceful, defiant, unshaken. Beneath it appeared her own words, recovered from the margins of a later diary found in Canada. Freedom is not the opposite of bondage. It is the proof that love can rewrite ledgers. The visitors returned. Descendants came again, this time with smartphones and documentaries. A woman from Toronto named Naomi Rochelle, Henry's great-great-granddaughter, stood beneath the magnolia tree where the key had been buried and read aloud a poem she'd written. Here, mercy was measured in footsteps, revenge in patience, justice in silence. The crowd fell still. Even the cicadas paused, as if the air itself remembered the rhythm. Scene, the river's final testimony. All debt settled. That night, drones recorded something no technology could explain. From above, The Mississippi shimmered with thin bands of phosphorescence that traced a perfect spiral near Willowbrook's bend. Scientists called it an algal bloom, reacting to pollution and moonlight. Locals said it was the river signing its name again. A week later, when the current calmed, the spiral had vanished. But on the shore, a thin line of silt had arranged itself into words that a ranger noticed before the tide reclaimed them. All debts settled. Jordan remained at Willowbrook long after the project ended, unable to leave the place that felt both archive and confession. One evening, during the wet hush that follows summer storms, Jordan sat in the study with the lights off, the ledger open, the window breathing the river's damp air. From somewhere deep within the house came the soft clink of glass and the smell of magnolia, and then a voice, low, steady, and kind, spoke not aloud, but inside the quiet. You came to measure what cannot be measured, but you have written us back into the world. That is enough. When Jordan looked up, the portrait of Celeste seemed to have changed. Her eyes were no longer looking out, but slightly upward, toward the river's shimmer. The echo. A covenant. A nation still learning to remember. Today, Willowbrook stands not as a museum, but as a covenant. Each year on the anniversary of the 1854 marriage, the union forged in cruelty that became the seed of redemption, people gather on the lawn. They bring candles and magnolia petals. They read the names from the walls below. Musicians play slow jazz that folds in a gospel, the sound rising toward the dark water. And as the last note fades, the crowd always hears what they've come to expect. A second sound, faint but clear, the river answering in time, repeating the rhythm of all the names it once carried. Is the echo beneath the river, the voice of a house that learned to pray, the sigh of a nation still learning how to remember. Celeste Aldrich is no longer a ghost. She's a story told correctly. And the river, faithful as always, whispers back the final line. Yandy, the drawer closes. The certificate waits. The water keeps its word. So, this story was inspired by the hidden histories of the American South, the records that survive in archives, the names carved into cellar walls, and the rivers that have carried both suffering and liberation. Willowbrook is a fictional plantation, but it stands for every place where cruelty was challenged by courage and where mercy was written in the margins of ledgers meant for counting human beings as property. The marriage certificate that begins and ends this story is a document of both oppression and subversion, a legal record that became the foundation for a different kind of legacy. In the end, the question is not whether history remembers us, but what we choose to remember about history. The river keeps its word.